Okay, so this is the Bible study for Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 through Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. And we're continuing our study in the book of Exodus. And the text says, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during the childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. So they let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people. Every Hebrew boy that is born to you must throw into the Nile. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it in tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put him in among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So you can remember, you can download the PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive, so that you can follow along as we read and answer the questions about this text. And the text will be Exodus 1:11 through 2:10. Number 1 says, what did we learn last week at the beginning of Exodus, which sets up the entire Exodus story? A, we learned the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt. That's true. B, Joseph and his generation died. That's also true. C, the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, multiplied greatly, and increased in numbers. That's true. And that really sets up the reason for everything that's going on in this chapter, this text, and then in the following, in the rest of Exodus. D, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came into power in Egypt, and that was that ominous statement that we talked about. That kind of sets up everything as well, because no matter what was happening with the Israelites, it kind of seems to be understood that Joseph had done so much for Egypt and for the previous Pharaoh that he would have had favor, but this new king doesn't care about Joseph at all. And then E says the new king was concerned that these numerous Israelites would fight against Egypt if war broke out. And that's true. So now I would argue, just let's think it through. They won't fight against you if you treat them well, if you make them feel at home, if you make them feel like a part of you, then they won't rebel against you. That's also another way you could solve this problem. But that's just how I might counsel a leader who was making a decision like this. There's more than one way to solve this problem. And there's one way, but then, of course, we know in the history of our world, with the way we look at other people and other cultures so often, hopefully not as much anymore, but certainly in history it was true, that making somebody feel at home and like a part of you is, well, one, harder than you might think, and two, often not a possible option. It's not something that these leaders might have considered. So number 2 says, what according to 1:11 through 14 did the Egyptian king do to try to keep Israel under control? So it tells us that he oppressed them. He treated them really badly, oppressed them with forced labor, and basically completely enslaved them, which actually made them more likely to rebel against the situation. So not a really great plan if he was really worried about what he said he was worried about, but he did it anyway. Number 3, what does verse 12 tell us about the effectiveness of this plan? It says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So it may have, I don't know what they thought they were going to do. Maybe they thought they were going to make them so tired that they couldn't reproduce so rapidly, or that they were unhealthy so they couldn't reproduce, or I don't know what the plan was, or just crack down on their activities and keep them busy and keep them, or maybe they thought, yeah, it's okay if they multiply, just as long as they're enslaved and they multiply our workforce and not and they're not free to fight back and things like that. Maybe that was their plan, but ultimately Israel did not stop multiplying. It seems like they multiplied even more as they were oppressed. Number 4, what did the Egyptian king try next? According to verses 15 and 16, well, he told the Hebrew midwives to kill all the boys. I don't know. It's generally the girls that give birth. It's been my experience. But maybe he thought, it does take 2. I'm not going to get into health education here, but it does take 2. And in my experience, one female can reproduce with one male or multiple males, or, well, anyway, that's just what I've seen. One, well, anyway, let's not go down that path anymore. So they wanted to kill all the boys. They let the women live. Seems to me like if you were trying to create an effective slave population, you might kill the girls and keep, but maybe I'm just, kind of silly because I'm a man. Maybe I think that, why are they always doing that to the men? But that was what he tried next, have the midwives kill all the boys, and let the girls live. See, I'm trying to make sense of all this. It's something that just really doesn't make sense to begin with. I think I know that Pharaoh was behaving out of fear, so not logic. And so none of it was making sense. Let's see. Number 5 says, how did the midwives respond according to verse 17? The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. So they responded. They didn't do what they were told. Now, what's interesting, it says this is because they feared God. The midwives, however, feared God, so they didn't do what the king of Egypt. And I think I shared this last week in our sermon time, but what's really apparent and important is that they feared God more than they feared the king of Egypt. Because if they feared the king of Egypt more, they would have done what he said. And so let me just say that says something. Who is most important to you to please? Who is it that you think it's most important that they're happy with you and not angry with you? Is it the king, or is it God? Is it your friends, or is it God? Is it your family, or is it God? Because if we fear God more than we fear, and when we say fear, we mean respect, but we also mean we could define it as worrying about what they think. How much does it matter to us what they think? And the reason for instance, if it matters to us what our friends think, the reason that it matters to us oftentimes is that we fear some sort of negative reaction. So if we respond to peer pressure, a lot of times it's because we fear being made fun of or not being liked, or whatever negative consequence might come from not doing what they think we should do. And so when we talk about God, it's the same kind of situation. I mean, yes, God has wrath that we ought to fear if we don't follow in his path, but in the end, we care. Do we fear God? If we're saying, do I fear God, what we're really asking is, do we care what God thinks, and not want the negative consequences of him thinking ill of us? Okay. Or do we fear what our friends think or our family thinks or whatever, and we fear more their negative consequences if they think ill of us or they don't like what we do? And so I think that's the best way to understand this concept of fearing God. It's not that we're shaking afraid. These midwives weren't shaking afraid, but they cared what God thought more than they cared what the king thought. They feared the negative consequences of not doing God's will more than they feared the negative consequences that would come as a result of not doing Pharaoh's will. And so they did God's will instead of Pharaoh's will. And by the way, God is more powerful. He's the one we really should fear more. He's more powerful, and therefore he can protect us. So then we find out that when the midwives did what God wanted rather than what Pharaoh said, then God was able to take care of them. God was able to protect them from Pharaoh and even bless them and give them positive outcomes, because, and this scripture tells us, it's because of their faithfulness and because they did what God wanted. Number 6 says, what happened when the king of Egypt found out about the continued multiplication of Israel, according to verses 18 through 21? He asked them, why have you done this? So he does call them to account. So that had to be fear-inducing right there. B, the midwives told Pharaoh that Hebrew women are different from Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. And that just gave me a little chuckle. We're different. We have different cultural characteristics. We have different, we're different. And I don't know why. I think maybe if they were having lots and lots of kids, that might have been maybe not a lie. Maybe there was some truth or basis of truth in that, some shred of truth. But my guess is they didn't always give birth before the midwives arrived. The midwives were faithful and did not kill the boys. C, God protected the midwives because they feared him and gave them families of their own. So he protected them and he blessed them. Number 7, what did Pharaoh do next? According to 122, it says, then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people, not just to the midwives now. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And so he maybe did not believe the midwives, or at least didn't leave it in their hands anymore. He said, now everybody, if you see a Hebrew boy that's been born, you throw them into the Nile. So that's a little more harsh even than the first command. Number 8, what happened in 2:1 through 10? A Levite of the tribe that would later become the priests couple gave birth to a son. And that's true. B, she hid her son for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she floated him in a basket with tar and pitch to waterproof it and hid him in the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So she basically built a boat out of a basket, and floated it in the reeds so that he wouldn't go downriver. So the reeds would grow along the bank where there's less current and the water's a little more still or swirling, and then the reeds would hold the basket in place and then also hide the child. And so she did that. She threw him in the Nile, but she did not kill him by throwing him in the Nile. So she sort of followed the rule, but not exactly followed the rule. But there was some risk in this, right? We don't know what could have happened if the current had caught him, or even if Pharaoh's daughter had not been so kind. C, his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Yes. D, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe and saw the basket among the reeds. Yes. E, his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter if she could go get a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. So she's watching and she sees that Pharaoh's daughter feels sorry for him and is not about to have him killed. And so she suggests a solution. Now, let me just say that Hebrews and Egyptians would have looked different. And so I imagine there might have been some intermarrying that happened. I don't know. But if that did happen, then maybe they began to look a little bit more similar. But what we know of the Hebrews today and of Egyptians today is that they would have looked different. So it would have been clear to Pharaoh's daughter that the girl that was asking if she could go get a Hebrew woman to nurse her, to nurse Moses, would have been a Hebrew girl who would know Hebrew girls, Hebrew mothers, and so all of that, maybe, I don't know, we might take that into account to just consider how compassionate Pharaoh's daughter was in saving this child and allowing for all this to happen, and how much God might have given Moses in particular and this family favor with Pharaoh's daughter. And then it says she went and got the baby's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter had the child's own mother nurse him until he grew older and became the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And that happened, and then Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses. Number 9, how does this story set up? How does the story set up in 1:11 through 22 contrast with the birth of Moses in 2:1 through 10? I really think it's significant and important to see how difficult the circumstances were in Exodus 1. And that's wrapped up from the beginning, where we found out, the Pharaoh came who knew not Joseph, and he was worried about all the stuff we did in the intro question to this Bible study from the beginning, was sort of brought to a culmination in the description of what Pharaoh was doing to try to stop the Israelites from reproducing and multiplying so quickly. And he clamped down hard. The oppression was hard. The forced labor, hard. The killing of babies that was ordered to multiple different people was hard. But then when we get to chapter 2, we have a situation where it's clear that God is watching over them nonetheless. So as hard as the setup seems, yet we have this story of God's protection and God's salvation and God taking care of Israel, no matter what kind of difficult situation they were going through. And so it's important to see that contrast, because I know that sometimes in modern days, we think of God's protection as, if God's really protecting me, I won't go through hard times. But what we see in this story is Israel going through a very difficult time, and yet God is there protecting in the midst of it. He doesn't take away every circumstance, but he is active and he does protect and he does save. And so that contrast is really important, because I fear that we start to think that God's protection and his favor and his care means we won't go through hard times. And so then when we go through hard times, we think God is absent. But in this story, placing these two pieces of the story side by side, like we do, like the author did, like God did in forming this book, and like we are in studying them together, is significant. So it does seem like it changes directions, and you say, Pastor Pete, well, maybe you should have put this in, like added that chapter 1 part to the first Bible study and then taken this as a different. No, I put these together in the Bible study on purpose, because God put them together in the text, and I don't believe that that contrast is an accident. I think that that contrast speaks something to us about how God can work in our lives, even when there are difficult circumstances and oppression that we wish wasn't happening. Number 10 says, have there been times in our life when our life sounds like the story setup? I don't know if it's ever, honestly, I think if we compared apples to apples, it's never been that bad. But there certainly have been difficult times in all of our lives. And I think sometimes when we compare how bad is bad and who's got it worse, we're just setting us up for a problem. But we've had difficult times. We've all had difficult times, and whether it's really been that bad or not, it's certainly felt that bad. So then the question is, in those times, do we or did we expect God to do something like he begins to do in chapter 2? So were we expecting, when it was that bad, that God was setting up a miracle, that God was about to bring salvation, that God was there nonetheless and watching over and caring for us and protecting us nonetheless? Or do we think in those moments he's absent? And my experience has been, from just talking to people and even analyzing and reflecting on my own thoughts, my experience has been that I think we really usually think God is absent in those moments, and we don't recognize that he's about to do something amazing, and that he is still present no matter how bad things seem to get. And so that's what I want us to remember in this Bible study, is that in those moments, God is still present and he may be about to do something amazing.